I was about 17 or 18 at the time and worked at a coffee shop that was 10 minutes down the street from my parents' house. One of my neighbors, Alex, lived roughly 8 houses down from me and started coming in regularly for coffee and small talk with me. Alex was at least 45 or 50 years old, and as it turns out, he used to work with my dad and has lived in my neighborhood for years. Nothing about our conversation seemed weird or alarming to me. After a few months of completely normal interactions, he found me on Facebook. I accepted his friend request because I was young and had no social media boundaries at the time. This was when things started to get weird. He would DM me about things I was posting instead of commenting publicly. He would offer me rides to work or class and would make comments about my hair, makeup, and curves. I found out that he was married and had a son a few years younger than me. I started ignoring his messages and eventually removed him as a friend. When he came in for his coffees after this, he would ask for my number, wouldn't take no for an answer, and just generally made me uncomfortable. I started asking coworkers to serve him because my manager at the time refused to ban him from the store. I also learned that he used to send a past employee flowers and do the same things to her. Fast forward a few months, Alex seemed to have gotten the hint and stopped asking for me when he came into my workplace. One evening, I was walking my dog around my subdivision and smoking some weed, as I did most nights before bed. I walked the same route each night, which, unfortunately, meant I had to pass by his home. On my way back this night, I saw him out of the corner of my eye coming out of his house with a baseball bat. He stood in his front yard for a few minutes, and then I could hear him starting to walk behind me, and I panicked. I was also high and unsure if I should be alarmed or not. Some kids in the duplex across the street started banging on the window and making a bunch of noise. I was too scared to even look up at them. My dog started getting agitated, and I decided to start running since I was only about 2 minutes from home, and I figured I could make it inside and lock the door. Alex must have been spooked by the noise and stopped following me. I'm very thankful for those kids who knew that situation didn't look right and tried to warn me. It worries me to think about what would have happened if they hadn't. This incident happened about 6 years ago. I was back home taking a leave of absence from college and decided to get a job at the law library at the local courthouse. The library was on the second floor in the middle of a long hallway. There were 4 of us that worked there at the time. I was the youngest, and because of this, I often was in charge of closing by myself. When you closed, you had to go around the library, double-check that it was empty, and turn off the computers. Most importantly, you had to turn off the Wi-Fi router on the second floor. One day I was at the checkout desk, which allowed me to see everybody coming in and out. And about 30 minutes before closing, a man, dressed in all black with a backpack on, comes in and goes to one of the corner computers. He had kind of a creepy vibe, but I chose to ignore it. It was 10 minutes before the end of the night, so I started going around letting everybody know that I was closing. I get to the aforementioned guy and inform him that I'm closing the library down. He just nodded, avoiding eye contact. I was weirded out, but all I cared about was getting home. I start powering down the computers and double-checking that everyone is gone. The library appears completely empty, so I go upstairs to turn off the router. This was my least favorite part due to the router being in the conference room at the end of a dark hallway. I walked through the doorway of the conference room, and I looked to my left to find the creepy guy crouched down in the corner, just muttering to himself. I literally felt my heart drop. For some reason, I inform him that I'm just turning off the router, and that I'll leave as soon as I turn it off. I then proceeded to do the stupidest thing ever, and I turn my back to him. I turn off the router and book it out of there, down the stairs, and into the hallway of the courthouse. There was literally nobody around because it was 5 o'clock. I run to the end of the hallway and knock on the door of the office. Nobody answered, so I started panicking and crying and knocking louder. Finally, after what felt like forever, this woman opened the door. I asked her if she could please call the bailiff. In my haste to get out of the library, I had left my phone behind. I told her there's a man that's not leaving the library and he's acting strangely. 5 or so minutes pass and a police officer shows up. He goes up to the second floor of the library to check it out. He comes back down and says that the door is locked and that the guy has barricaded himself inside. As the officer is calling for backup, the weird dude casually walks out like nothing happened. As he's walking down the hallway, he turns back and smiled at me. I thankfully never saw him again. This happened when I was around 12 years old. It was the middle of the night, and my dad had to work the graveyard shift. Since it was the weekend, I had stayed up most of the night. It was somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m., and my dad messaged me and told me to lock the doors and go to sleep. I went to my room and finally fell asleep, but only for about an hour or so. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of knocking on my back door. It scared me awake, but after taking a few moments to process what I heard, I decided it was probably just my dad knocking on the door. Maybe he had just forgotten something. Me being really exhausted, I knew he had a house key on him, so I just assumed he would unlock the door himself, but the knocking continued, and it was starting to creep me out. The next thing I knew, the knocking on the back door had stopped, but now the same knocking was coming from a different location. It sounded like someone was knocking on the window in my kitchen. I continued to assure myself it was my dad, but I didn't understand why he couldn't just unlock the door himself. At this point, I was pretty freaked out, and I obviously wasn't answering the door. If anything, my dad would call me to come open it for him. The knocking changed again to another window. I was terrified now, too scared to get up and check who was out there. The knocking wasn't stopping, and the next thing I know, the knocking moved to my front door, but this time it was much harsher and louder. That's when it hit me that I couldn't move at all. I was actually frozen in fear. I couldn't scream or talk or move any muscles at all. My heart was dropping as the knocking moved to another window closer and closer to my bedroom window where my curtains were basically see-through. I didn't know what to do or say, and my fear completely consumed me. I moved my eyes over to the window, and my heart stopped when I saw a tall man with a dark ski mask peering through my window. I could hardly make out the details because it was so dark, but I think his mask had some sort of a skeleton design on it. He tilted his head slightly toward me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out of me. I closed my eyes as hard as I could, and I started telling myself it's not real, over and over again. After what felt like hours, I finally opened my eyes, and there was no one there. I sighed in relief, until I heard a loud whisper tell me, "I'll cut you." Everything suddenly stopped. I couldn't move, and I couldn't sleep anymore that night. I laid there shaking with my eyes closed until morning. It didn't feel like a dream, and I've never experienced sleep paralysis before. Everything felt so real. I don't know what happened that night, but I pray I'll never have to experience that again. It was one of the most frightening moments of my life. I was home alone all day that day, so nobody could back me up. But the following morning, I asked my dad when he came back from work if he had come home earlier that day and knocked on the doors and windows. He hadn't.